children, as you are aware, we are currently on a series of lessons covering humility, mercy, grace, and service. For each of these qualities that I will be covering today and also in the next couple of weeks, we will first see how this quality is explained in the Bible, how that quality is exemplified through a character in the Bible, and lastly, an application as to how we can exercise that quality in our lives. This week, we will be covering on the aspect of humility. Let us first explain what humility is. For this, let us turn to 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5. Likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble. The Greek word for the word humility here can also be translated and is defined as the word modest, modesty, humbleness, and also lowliness. These are the definitions of the word humility. Interestingly, it is also contrasted with the word proud in this passage. The Greek word for the word proud also means appearing above others and also haughty. This brings to mind a person who thinks he is towering and looking down on others, when in actual fact he has the same or even lower status than others. Next, let us see how humility is exemplified through a character from the Bible. For this, we'll be looking at the example of John the Baptist and see how he exemplifies humility. Early on in his ministry, John the Baptist gained many followers. In Matthew chapter 3, verse 5, we can see that his preaching spread to many in the region, covering the people of Jerusalem, Judea, and Jordan. As a result of his preaching, many went to listen to him. Luke chapter 3, verse 12 and 14 tells us that both the publicans and the soldiers listened to him. Matthew chapter 3, verse 7 tells us that the Pharisees and Sadducees were listening to him as well. And as such, his preaching also sparked action amongst people who listened to him. In Mark chapter 1, verse 5, it tells us that those who went out to listen to him were baptized of him, confessing their sins. So we can see that his preaching was very powerful. After the baptism and temptation of Jesus, we can see that Jesus began his ministry, and soon after that attracted many followers as well. In John chapter 3, verse 26, we can see that John's disciples alerted John that Jesus and his disciples were baptizing as well, and in fact were baptizing more. Verse 26 reads, And they came unto John and said to him, Rabbi, he that was with thee beyond Jordan, to whom thou bearest witness, behold, the same baptizes, and all men come to him. It was almost as if that John's disciples wanted to warn John that he was losing influence and losing ground to Jesus. John's followers probably wanted to hear more from John as to what strategies he would use to regain prominence, perhaps moving to a different part of the region to preach, or even making his message more palatable. Instead, we see that John recognized the authority and prominence of Jesus. John chapter 3, verse 27 reads, John answered and said, A man can receive nothing except it be given him from heaven. And verse 28, Ye yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but that I am sent before him. We can see that John recognized the authority and prominence of Jesus, in that his message and authority of Jesus came from heaven. And as such, John felt joyful when the mission of Jesus is successful, even if it comes at a cost to John. John chapter 3, verse 29 reads, He that hath the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom, which standeth and heareth him, rejoiceth greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy, therefore is fulfilled. And John demonstrated his humility in lowering himself below Jesus. John chapter 3, verse 30 reads, He must increase, but I must decrease. We can see that John recognized the message of Jesus, given that it was from heaven, is more superior than his message. How can we have the same mindset as John the Baptist and exercise the same humility in our daily living? Firstly, like John, we should recognize God's purpose in our work and also in our lives. Just as John recognized that Jesus' work was more important than his work due to the divine origin of Jesus, we must also recognize that God's plans and purpose for our lives. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 reads, "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." From this passage, we can see that our divine purpose on earth is to show forth the praises of God to the world. Secondly, we should also bear in mind that the plans that we may have may be in direct opposition to God's plans for us. Using the example of John the Baptist, the success and prominence of his ministry over that of Jesus would be in direct contradiction to God's plan of salvation. In Romans chapter 7, verse 19, "For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do." So Romans chapter 7, verse 19 tells us that while we may know what we need to do to glorify and please God, many times we do not do that thing. And instead, we may go against God in our sinful nature, in our sinful ways. Galatians chapter 5, verse 17 also reads, "For the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary the one to the other, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would." Galatians chapter 5, verse 17 tells us that instead, the desires of our flesh causes us to go against what we ought to do as children of God if we do not humble ourselves before God and before his plan for us. Thirdly, we should also have the wisdom and the maturity to humble ourselves, to submit ourselves to God's plans. We should follow the example of John the Baptist, who humbled himself and readily gave up his reputation, his prestige, and his influence so that the message of Christ will continue to spread. Let's turn to 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1 to 2. "For as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourself likewise with the same mind. For he that suffereth in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of man, but to the will of God." From this passage, we can see that we should no longer submit ourselves to the lust of the flesh, but to do the will of the God as God's children. As we reflect on the humility of John the Baptist, let's reflect as to how we can humble ourselves before the almighty hand of God in submitting our desires and also our plans and goals all to him. Thank you and have a good week ahead.
Holy and holy.